Hi, everyone. This is Jen Grisanti, and I am here with my story therapy interview with Vanessa Taylor. I am beyond excited to have Vanessa here. Vanessa is a guest speaker for the story therapy event, and I wanted to use this time because Vanessa has excelled to a very high level in television and film. I wanted to use this time for her to give you some insight on some of what she's learned in this process. Vanessa has worked widely in television, most recently as the co-executive producer on Game of Thrones. She then went into the film world and did Hope Springs, Divergent, Hillbilly Elegy, and The Shape of Water, for which she received an Oscar nomination. Welcome, Vanessa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it is my pleasure. I am beyond excited for everybody to hear what you have to say. Okay, so let's start with the question of why do you write?
So my mom is a writer, and I began writing probably as soon as I could essentially read and write, like when I was 7 or 8. And so I would probably be writing even if I was a lawyer, or which I thought I was going to be. I think, once you're a person who sort of hears voices in your head, that's kind of it for you. And I never knew I'd be able to make a living at it. That was such a wonderful, pleasant surprise, but I thought I would just always be writing, for myself.
I love that. I love the idea of the hearing of the voices and knowing it is your path. For me, as long as I've known you, and I met Vanessa when I was an executive, and I fell in love with her writing and met with her and then saw how spectacular a person she was. So it's fascinating for me how strongly you write from emotion. So when you look at emotion, do you draw a lot from your emotional truth?
So for me, they say film is an emotional medium. And I think when I began in film, I didn't really understand what that meant. But now what I kind of take it to mean is films succeed or fail on an emotional level. So you can have a really beautiful film, for instance, that doesn't engage the audience emotionally. And to my mind, that has on some level failed. For me, I have to be able to find the emotional journey of the character or characters in order to write something effectively. So it has a lot to do with how I determine what project I might take or what thing I might initiate on my own. If I'm offered something and I can't see a way into the emotional life of the character, then I usually just say, I'm sorry, I'm not the right person. Because for me, that's kind of where it's at. And likewise, if the structure of a story does not offer an emotional journey that I understand or feel I can execute, then I also wouldn't take that on, because to me, it just feels like you're sort of setting yourself up for failure right at the very beginning.
Yes, I agree. And I remember in a podcast interview that I did with you many years ago, I love what you said when you were talking about the idea of in Hollywood, if you're hired for a show that you're not the right fit, it's okay. And this kind of parallels the idea that if it's not a fit for what you feel your emotional well can execute at a high level, then so I love that. I think that is fantastic. Out of everything you've written, and I know they become like your children, but out of everything you've written, what would you say is your favorite project and why?
I would say the screenplay I wrote for Hope Springs is my favorite because it was the closest on paper to what I had in my mind. I think there's always a distance between what you're trying to communicate and what you actually end up expressing. And you know, sometimes you get much closer than you expect and sometimes you don't. And it's such a joy when you actually can somehow connect with other people and they see exactly what you hoped that they would see.
Oh, I love that. Now, with your writing process, so let's say you get a script, whether you're adapting a book, which I know you've been given a lot, and things like that, where do you start?
Well, it's different for different formats. For adapting a book, I usually start by just essentially summarizing everything that's in the book and then trying to convert to whatever structure you're going for. I mean, it's some version of I guess it's really, I look at things as first act, then 2A, 2B, and 3. So they call it a 3-act structure. In my mind, it's really 4 pieces of something. But I'm looking at how do I convert to that, and what are the pieces that are either missing that I need to fill in, or what are the pieces that are additional that I need to take out in order to have this be a structure that I can understand and that I think can work. But in general, I think it's a process of plotting out what you have and then asking yourself questions about what is missing or what doesn't make sense. And that can be like, it literally doesn't make sense, or it can be emotionally, this doesn't make sense. It's not adding up. I need to reconfigure something.
That is so true. And I love the idea of taking stuff out, of figuring out what isn't needed for the idea of the
So
emotion.
much of this
Yeah.
is removing things, and they talk about killing your darlings. And I do notice that you really have to be willing to toss things that don't work as a part of a whole, even if they work spectacularly on their own. You know, it happens all the time where someone will fall in love with a scene or a visual, and it just doesn't add to the whole. So it maybe belongs in another movie somewhere.
Right.
But it doesn't belong here. And it takes
Yeah.
a certain amount of mental discipline to say, well, even though I love it, I'm going to get rid of it.
See, and that almost comes into intuition too, which I feel like you are a very intuitive writer. Like, I feel like you've done the emotional work in life that I think helps you on the page in such a big way, wouldn't you say?
I think there's different kinds of intuition at work when you're working on a screenplay. One part of it is dialogue and the emotional intuition of characters. So can you get inside a character and see what they might want or be expressing? And I do feel like that's something that comes more easily to me. There's also intuition in a structural sense of, if something's not working, why isn't it working? Or, you know, some of it is very formulaic, but some of it is more an intuitive sense of, oh, I can see what this person's telling me to do, but it's not going to work. I can see that 10 steps down the road, we're going to have a problem. And so I think that kind of intuition is actually more like muscle memory, and some of that you get by just doing it over and over and over again.
Yeah. That I think when you look at intuition, and you look at logic versus emotion, which is so much of what is explored in film and in television, bringing us to the question about film and television. So you've done both, you've completely excelled in both arenas. What would you say is the main difference in storytelling between the two?
So if you're really specifically asking about storytelling, for me, the difference is that in a 2-hour structure, it becomes much more about structure. For me, television felt like you're making a loaf of bread and then you chop off pieces of the loaf of bread. But if you chop it here, you chop it here, it really doesn't make that big a difference. It's all still part of the piece of the loaf of bread. When you're dealing with a film, you have those 2 hours, and structure becomes much more of an integral part of how you're thinking about it, at least for me. And much more of a part of how I decide if I think I can tell a story. Whereas in television, something can be very open-ended. Maybe you don't know what the ending is of the story. Maybe you don't even want to know. It can go on for 5 seasons or 10. And so that's really not a part of it. So, and then there's a very clear lifestyle and temperament difference as well, in that television, you know, it's changed a lot over the years in terms of people do mini rooms or no room or remote rooms or whatever they're doing. But in general, television is a much more of a group activity for the writers. And it's also a situation where, as a writer, you begin to assume much more responsibility as a producer as you go along. And so for me, as an introvert, I'm much better suited, I think, to the film world, because the television world, you really need to engage with people in a very active way on a very regular basis. And I think that's for some people, and it's not as great for other people.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to bring out. I think it's important for people to understand where their desire is, their passion is, and their strength is in terms of being social versus not being social. Okay, for our last question, something we chatted about before we started, which I love that you tapped into. How can a writer be an entrepreneur? How can they look at their career in an entrepreneurial way?
Oh my gosh, in so many ways. So, you know, the great thing about being a writer is you can always write. So you don't have to wait around for people to come to you. But sometimes you're not finding the job you want, or you're not finding a job at all. And, you know, there's so many different ways. A great way, and it takes a lot of legwork, is to, you know, scour the world for great short stories that are out there. Most of them will only provide you with the first act of a movie, or maybe the pilot of a show, but that's a lot, you know, and a lot of them are available. Either they were never bought, or they were bought and the rights have fallen back. You can also, of course, just have your own original idea. You know, the spec market, I can't speak to the television side as well because I haven't worked there recently, but in film, you know, it's very hard to sell a spec. I won't lie. Like, it's not as easy as some of the success stories make it seem, but I do think writing an original piece is a great way to show people who you are, especially in the realm of voice. What is your voice? What is your perspective on the world? What do you sound like? What does your dialogue sound like? What do you think is important? All those things. And, you know, that original spec that you write that may get you a million jobs, that may never get made, because those tend to be smaller stories sometimes. But it doesn't mean it wasn't a great, not only artistic creation, but piece of business for you, because it acts as this calling card. And people would much rather read that than your attempt to write a blockbuster that doesn't really have a personal hook to it. I think, you know, you can always be entrepreneurial in digging up stories, and you can also be entrepreneurial in seeking out partnerships. Do you know a director who you could team up with? You know, there's just so many opportunities, and especially now, certainly in television, the opportunities to get a staff job have changed. I think there's really been a tidal shift in, you know, people are interested in diversifying their staffs, which is an amazing thing that I never thought I would see. But what it means for you, if you're like a young white guy, is that you better be entrepreneurial, because things have changed. But that really goes for everybody. There's not enough seats at the table, so you have to find a way to distinguish yourself and to tell whatever is personal to you. And that doesn't mean it has to be a true story. I think there's such a difference between telling your emotional truth and telling an actual true story, which can often be quite boring. Not always, but sometimes. So yeah, I think it's very much, and I think it's very much an entrepreneurial craft, in that you invest in your startup, if you will, your project, and you take a big risk. You put your own capital in terms of work and money and time and whatever. And so often it fails. And I mean, so often I have things fail all the time, and it's super painful. And the only thing that I think differentiates success and failure in the long term is, do you pick yourself up and keep going and just say, oh, well, forget it. Like, too bad. I spent 3 years and it added up to nothing. Or do you get bogged down in that failure and wanting to relitigate it and try to find a way to save it? And you're not going to. It's all about keeping going.
Okay, that message was so monumental, and I hope you all take that to heart and that recognition. I think the idea of this business is you are continuously going through ups and downs and rejections on the way to success, even after success. So I love that you tapped into that. I want to thank you so much. Oh my God, there are so many gems in here. I am so excited for people to hear this. I want to thank you so much for joining us and giving us insight on writing.
Okay, thank you.